Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and I am delighted to welcome you to this session in the George Talks Business Series. Now, before I introduce today's guest, let me introduce our moderator, Professor Danny Leipziger, Professor of Practice of International Business at George Washington School of Business and Managing Director of the Growth Dialogue. Dr. Leipziger was previously Vice President of the World Bank for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management. He was the Vice Chair of the Spence Commission on Economic Growth and Development, and he is a prolific author of numerous books, referee journal articles, and pieces for Vox EU, Project Syndicate, and others. And he has been on our faculty since 2009. Thank you, Danny, for moderating the session today.
Great pleasure to be here.
It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome today's very special guest, Dr. Afsane Beschloss, founder and CEO of Rock Creek, a leading global investment firm. Previously, she was managing director and partner at the Carlyle Group. She was treasurer and chief investment officer of the World Bank and worked at Shell International and JP Morgan. Ms. Beschloss has advised governments, central banks, and regulatory agencies on global public policy and financial policy. She is a recipient of multiple awards. She is on the boards of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Resources Institute, the American Red Cross, and is the vice chair of the Public Broadcasting Services. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Afsane Beschloss.
Thank you, Anuj.
Welcome both. Have a great conversation. Danny, over to you.
Thank you, Dean. Well, Afsaneh, welcome to our show. I just want to tell folks listening in that we are going to run until 1 p.m. and that if you have any questions, please send them into the chat section of YouTube or Facebook or whatever stream you're listening to. So, Afsaneh, we've known each other a long time, so I'm going to refer to you by first names. And it's really great to have you on our show. The first question I wanted to pose to you is that we know all the negative effects that the pandemic has had, and I read your newsletter from Rock Creek, which is very informative. And we know what's happening in terms of bankruptcies and unemployment and GDP loss, etc. But you are the expert in capital markets, so I wondered if I could ask you what your view is of what we are seeing or what we're likely to see, because stock market is doing pretty well, maybe because of very low interest rates. But are we likely to return to anything close to even the old new normal? Or do we have some fundamental shifts that are going on?
So thank you, Danny, for the lovely introduction, and thank you very much, Anuj, also for your lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be here today with you and with friends of George Washington University, and look forward to our conversation. Danny and I do go back a long way. In fact, just before we locked down, I think we had Danny over to give one of the most interesting talks, including on the subject of Black Swan. And that was literally before we all shut down. So you should really be the one we're speaking to, Danny. In terms of sort of markets, I think it's been really interesting. As we all well know, what we're seeing is, while markets are up, and including on some days, including today as we're having this conversation, it really is 5 stocks are up while a lot of stocks might be going sideways or down. And that is the phenomena that we've seen, really not, of course, in particular post-COVID, but if you look in the last 10 years, what we've seen is the creation of what I call the mega stocks. So the large cap stocks that became huge. And we saw that in the US. The other place we see that is in particular in China. And these are the big tech or tech-related type companies that are becoming mega companies with incredible power, incredible reach, and stifling, in some cases, smaller entrepreneurs who are starting to start their companies. in terms of capital markets, as you said, the impact of these mega companies, I think, remains to be seen, because it is really an area that has come to fore in the last 10 years. The old oil companies or big state-owned companies that we saw both in the US, emerging markets, etc., really that phenomena is shifting very, very fast. I would just say that there are 2 or 3 things that are worth looking at. Everyone talks about the energy sector, but if we look at the energy sector in MSCI or S&P or really any index, it has come down from 10 or 15%, depending on what index you're looking at, to 2 or 3%. So the share is really small. The area that is growing very fast is renewable energy, where if we look at, let's say, a 50 stock portfolio that we look at on the renewable side, it has done so much better compared to traditional energy. The other areas that are really interesting is the intersection of technology, health, and education. And we're seeing, as all of us are living, to use telemed, and we're using the long distance education and long distance modes of communication, that the new companies that are prospering, but also the future companies, will be very much these kinds of companies. So we're going through sort of a radical transformation of capital markets as we speak. And we're seeing that those who are more adept at changing and adapting are, as usual, the ones who might be surviving.
Well, it's very interesting, and I think among those that may not survive, we're also seeing in the financial press, conversations about is there going to be another financial crisis beyond the general global recession that we're in now. Gillian Tett, who I'm sure you know, in the FT, was talking about, where should we look for the next financial crisis? And it's always been the case that, it's not going to originate in the same place that the last one did. So we don't expect it to be in housing, or we don't expect it to be necessarily in the banking sector, which has been strengthened. But if you were to look, and coming back to the black swan events, if you were to look at the risks out there in the financial sector, where do you see the riskiest segments or elements or factors?
I think I would start with the phenomenon of megastocks. Means again that that others are having problems, but also there's been a lot written, including last weekend by our friend Diane Julius, who also is an ex-World Banker, who is on our advisory board at Rock Creek and a friend of many here in DC. And she had a piece in the FD also talking about zombie companies, because a lot of the money that the governments have been pushing, whether it is in the US or Europe in particular, has been to companies that may or may not be future companies in terms of success. And so if that's where our resources are going, and they're not going into other areas, what is going to happen as we come out of this? And as you very correctly said, Danny, debt is a huge problem. So if we look, let's say, at emerging markets that have accumulated dollar-denominated debt, if we have the dollar strengthen more from where we are, that could be a potential area in emerging market debt that we should look at, those who have a bigger debt burden. Commercial real estate, obviously in the US, is enormous. That market is huge. And look at, again, when are you going to go back to your offices? When we walk downtown DC, when you walk downtown New York, when you walk downtown many big cities all over the world, ex-Northern Asia, you're seeing deserted parts of cities. And while things will become, as you said, some sort of new normal after this, life is going to be different. More people will work from home. More people are making adjustments to live and work differently. And so that sector of the economy is going to get restructured and reorganized. So people who are sitting on large amounts of commercial debt today, obviously, and the bankers who lend to them, even though the banks are in much better situation, as you said, compared to 2008, those who have a very large commercial debt burden might have big problems. Interesting anecdote is that those who've been investing in affordable housing have actually done a lot better if they did it the right way and with the right values. So I would say those are two major areas.
Right. Well, let me follow up on the emerging market risks, as you correctly pointed out, which is that emerging markets shocked in the first quarter by the downturn, cuts in remittances, capital outflows, now capital coming back in, basically had very few options for many of these emerging markets, and many of them went back into the capital markets to borrow. And they were already fairly highly indebted to begin with. So you and I spent many years at the World Bank worrying about countries that were overly indebted. Now, Carmen Reinhart, one of the experts in financial crises, is the new World Bank chief economist. And she's been writing and warning that many countries are going to face problems of debt repayment, debt rescheduling. And so I wonder, from your side of the equation, since you are investing a lot of money for a lot of large groups, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and others, how do you view the risks associated with these reschedulings? Because a decade or two ago, there were a spate of reschedulings, and there was sort of a mechanism for it. And that mechanism is not so clear these days. And so from your vantage point, how do you see that potentially working?
You're absolutely right, Danny. I think when you and I were growing up, the Paris Club renegotiations of the debt was sort of a very major part of the renegotiation on the debt. I think as we see, there is now obviously government and debt, but also a large amount of corporate debt in emerging markets that has come in to be a much bigger part of the total EM debt that is out there. But I think what I worry about is obviously the IMF has been standing by and has been waiting for some countries to have problems, and countries have been going to the IMF. It's interesting because given the Fed standby window, we have not had as many issues, as we would have expected in the last 6-7 months. As you very correctly said, that may be very different in 2021, 2022, as a lot of this debt comes to mature, and we're going to have big issues without really good structures. I think one of the big issues that is really, really important to me is that the World Bank and the IMF, all these big multilateral institutions, need to sort of get more power, because a lot of the things that resided inside these banks, inside these multilaterals, was helped us to do the restructurings that we did in the past. And as we are moving forward, we need to have the organizations such as the World Bank have more of a say, but also more of an involvement, so that we have a more orderly system. And then the IMF obviously has got a certain amount of resources, but their resources are not unlimited. And if we get into a bad situation, they certainly will need a lot more resources to help the situation.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I think the one of the other differences between the situation now and in the next year or two and the one that surrounded debt reschedulings in the past for Latin America or other regions is the role of China. And
Right.
it's sort of a topic that people dance around because there are all sorts of political issues at play. But it's really the case that China has, because of its surpluses, been a large source of capital, and so they're a big creditor. And we just saw in the case of Zambia now that wants to call a halt to its repayments for 6 months. We saw this in the rescheduling of Ecuador, where China was a big player. That without China inside the tent, you can't really do a lot of these reschedulings because everybody wants to be treated equally. And so I think we do need the bank and the fund to be more active, but we also need China inside the tent. So I wonder if, you hear and see a lot of things. What's your sense about how active China might be in these reschedulings?
I think you're so right, Danny. And I think one of the, you and I both have been working on China, with China, in China, since really the early 1990s. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, which is a difference compared to earlier years in China, is that China is kind of using its own institutions, its own newly created multilaterals, and its own really government to do the to do anything they're doing in capital markets or with the countries that owe China. And they have really not been doing it through the multilaterals as we know them. This is a major, major issue for both the multilaterals and China. And I think until China does come into the tent, as you said, it's not good for either party. And if China wants to have, at the end of the day, a good ending to the negotiations on their debt, they will need to have the multilaterals that represent all countries, not just the countries that are inside the few that that China has created to be involved in the process. I think what you're saying is so important. I think the other side, which we did not talk about, is the whole subject of equity markets, where equity flows into emerging markets insofar as there is net flow, and that has been limited over the last few years, not just post-COVID, is going mainly into China. And so so much less is going to the rest of emerging markets, whether it is LATAM, whether it is Eastern Europe, whether it is Africa or Asia ex-North Asia.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. So we have limited time, so I'm going to switch topics a little bit so we can get to a couple of more themes. The recent Jackson Hole meeting was interesting in the sense that Chairman Powell spoke about bringing inflation up in the U.S., which is sort of odd for central bank governors to want to promote inflation. Of course, they're most afraid of deflation for reasons that you and I know very well. But I was just wondering what your sense was from the capital market side of the store as to whether or not the Fed can actually engineer a change in inflation in the U.S. because monetary policy can't be any looser than it is today. I mean, the Fed's balance sheet is quadrupled in size. So, so what do the markets think about this, and how likely is it that we can see the Fed actually bringing the inflation rate up a bit?
You're so right, Danny. I think Chairman Powell has tried to use all the tools that are at his disposal to help with the crisis that we are in the middle of. Just like, previously we saw with Chairman Bernanke in the middle of 2008. And I think the issue that we're seeing that is a problem is the limitations of monetary policy, which Chairman Powell talks about every day almost, or every occasion that he has to talk about. And it is very unusual, as you said, for a central banker to talk about increasing inflation versus not. To me, and I think to Anuj, I'm sure the biggest issue, and given you used to run the poverty reduction area of the World Bank, Danny, yourself for many years, and your leadership in that area, the big problem we have is the issue of inequality and how the creation of wealth has really benefited a smaller and smaller group of people. When we all studied economics, it was, in developing countries, you had this problem, but in the emerged world, developed world, this problem was getting much more resolved. Now you're in a situation where the US has one of the most unequal distributions of income and of wealth. And until you fix that, you're not going to really have growth. How do you get people to consume? They need to have a living wage. And if you're still arguing whether a living wage is under $10 or more than $10 or $15, no benefits, how are people going to live on that and could be able to earn a living and educate their kids and provide some basic health services to their family? So until we resolve that, consumption is not going to grow. If consumption does not grow, and you have an immigration policy that is very restrictive, you don't have new immigrants coming in to buy goods either, who's going to be consuming? If you have no consumption, you have no growth, or you have very limited growth. It's what we saw before COVID even hit us. So until we seriously address that, and I think seriously means seriously, not just speeches, but actual action by policymakers and the private sector, we're not going to resolve this problem.
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head, and I'm impressed by the fact that some figures, probably including you, in the private sector, are acknowledging that it's not only a question of equity and social justice and calm, but it's also just simple economics. It's not a great idea to have, as you said, people without income and consumption, and I would imagine that we're also going to have to deal with the issue of how do we finance the fiscal deficits in the U.S. I mean, the CARES Act, and if we have another one, has raised, the deficit to 15% of GDP. So we're talking about, even if it comes down over time, national debt has gone up. It's going to have to be financed. Okay, interest rates are very low now. That's convenient. But at some point, one might have to consider some things that have been anathema to most economists and financial markets, which is something along the lines of maybe a temporary wealth tax or something like that to bring the deficit back down from 140% of GDP to a more manageable number, at least for the U.S. Of course, we have, as Eichengren has said, the exorbitant privilege of printing, but still, we have some issues that revolve very much around what you're saying, which is the inequality aspect of it dominates a lot of different areas of both economics and finance. And I think seeing people like you speak out about it would be great, because between you and Jamie Dimon, you control so much of the financial sector, Afsaneh.
Oh, right. Of course, absolutely. But I think the difference is that, like you, I worked at the World Bank. I actually truly believe in some of the things that we're talking about. And I think the bankers, and I did work early on at JP Morgan, I think really have a lot of power. That's why I would say it's time to change the topic. So, for some of your students, I'll just share an anecdote. When I left JP Morgan and came to the World Bank, my salary income was almost the same. Today, if somebody has worked at JP Morgan for a few years, or Goldman, or in private equity or whatever, versus the World Bank, which is a pretty well-paid job, huge difference, right? I don't think that the importance to society or to financial markets has changed so much. So finance has been taking a huge amount of the goods. And I think, as you said, taxation will be important, but also the division of what we make every day in the workplace between people and among different groups in terms of different income groups is going to be also important. Taxes will not solve the fact that we have very low wages moving forward. And so again, coming to your students who are really living in a world where ESG and impact are much more important, it is really interesting to see how our companies, again, changing their policies and doing things versus giving the speeches.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we have only 5 minutes left. So I wanted to follow up on something that implicitly you have mentioned, which is our students. So GW has, as you know, a range of interesting programs, undergraduate, MBA. We have a new slew of new master's programs in the business school. But right. You're on the hiring side, and I know you've taken some of our interns from our capital markets program in the past. But as you look at the students that graduate from GW or other institutions of its type, what types of skills are you looking for now, and are they any different than you might have been looking for in your hiring a decade ago? Or what advice can you give to our students, I guess, is the basic point.
I wanted to congratulate both you and especially Anuj in terms of, having one of the best business schools, and really what you've done, which is in addition to the regular business school, the executive program that you've created, and these other degree programs, which are really, really important. And as you mentioned, we have been very fortunate in the sense that we've had great summer interns and great long-term interns, and then colleagues who've joined from the program. And in fact, colleagues who've been working full-time at Rock Creek and doing an MBA while working at GW, and found the experience incredibly helpful. And I think what I would say is that there are skills that we can all learn, but there are the values that are more important. And I think that's part of the culture of GW, which is really critical. And what we find, we have hired quite a number of people post-COVID. And I say, what are the characteristics? It's similar to pre-COVID, except that now you need to be much more, not just resilient, which is a word that is commonly used, but much more flexible, because whatever you're hired for today will change. So whatever job description you have today will change. We don't know exactly how it will change, whether it is at Rock Creek or you go to a different kind of company, but our lives are changing very rapidly. So your ability to be flexible matters. And it is that interconnectivity you're getting in the programs between learning accounting, learning corporate finance, trying to take computer science classes, not because you'll become a computer scientist, but really knowing in the future you will be running a major corporation or a major nonprofit or anything else that you started yourself. And you would have to have those kinds of skills, not just the skills to manage the old kind of companies, but companies that have technology as an ingredient, as a very integral part of the business. And so if you don't understand that, I think you have a problem. The other side is, things that were theoretical, like the ethics of business or really doing things the right way, I think will become even more important as we move forward. And I hope the students are taking those as seriously as both of you are.
Well, thank you very much. You should also know that much more than half of our students are women. You are one of the most successful women in your field. And often, as I interview successful women, I ask them this question, which is, what other advice can you give to women in the financial sector who see a future career there? And how has the glass ceiling perhaps been lifted a little bit compared to a decade or two ago? Do you think it's an easier path for women or not?
I think, Danny, it has become easier. COVID made it harder again, right? COVID, because women also have had the traditional role in terms of caregiver to parents, to kids, to families. I think that role is stopping women. My advice is always continue doing your work. There might be situations in life where you might have to do 20%, but go to 20%. Don't go to zero. I think it's really important for women to do one or two things, I think. One is start thinking about a career that does allow you to have a life outside of work as well. And that's something that women in my generation really did not do as well as you can today. Secondly, do things that are outside your workplace, because those are going to have back to connect, we're talking about connectivity, a board, whether it is a school board, whether it's a community board. Those experiences are going to be very valuable to women and men. And I think women, because they're so busy with multitasking, often do not do a school board, do not do a community board, do not do a nonprofit board, or a for-profit board, because it does not fit into their schedules. Do those, because those will be really important. And I know in my career and in my life, it has been very enriching.
Yeah, well, and you've contributed on many boards, from the Murray School to all the areas that you're in now. So we've come to the end of our allotted time. I want to thank Afsane Beschloss most wholeheartedly for sharing your very insightful views on many topics with us. And I want to thank those who have listened in and those that will catch the streaming of this event. I want to thank Irina and our dean for coming up with this George Talks Business series. which has been very successful. And I want to mention that on Thursday at 1 p.m., Dean Marotra will be interviewing Baroness Joanna Shields, the CEO of Benevolent AI. And next week we will have, I think, at least one other George Talks Business series with Professor Mike Spence, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Afsaneh, for sharing your thoughts with us. And we appreciate it very much. We hope here at GW to see more of you in the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you.
Bye-bye.